All right. So Leviticus is a super fun book in that most people don't think that it's a super fun book. But Leviticus is one of, maybe outside of the Gospels or some of the books in the New Testament, but Leviticus is one of the books that surprisingly speaks the most about Jesus. Surprisingly, if you didn't know. So that's, I think a lot of the stuff that I'm going to point out is ways that we see Jesus going through the book of Leviticus. I know, because why wouldn't we? But I also want to hear y'all's input as well. It's been a while since I've led an interactive Bible study. So apologies if it doesn't go well or if it doesn't go smoothly. But this is Calvary Chapel. How often do things go smoothly around here anyway?
I'm excited.
I'm glad you're excited. All right. So what I figured we'd do is go ahead and just read the first 9 verses together. And then as we're reading, just kind of pay attention to the things that stand out to you. And then we'll talk about those things afterwards. Sound okay?
Yes.
All right. And I guess I will read, and that way there's no awkwardness from calling on people. Then the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of animals from the herd or the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer it a male without defect. He shall offer it at the doorway of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, that it may be accepted for him to make atonement on his behalf. He shall slay the young bull before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priest, shall offer up the blood, and sprinkle the blood around on the altar that is at the doorway of the tent of meeting. He shall then skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron the priest shall put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. Then Aaron's sons, the priest, shall arrange the pieces, the head and the suet over the wood which is on the fire that is on the altar. Its entrails, however, and its legs, he shall wash with water. And the priest shall offer up in smoke all of it on the altar for a burnt offering, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord." So there we go. First 9 verses. We're off to an excellent start. It's totally not legal at all, except that it is. What?
In this list?
Okay. So what stands out to you guys as we read through those first 9 verses? Anything?
Sacrificial lamb.
Okay.
A male without defect.
A male without blemish? Absolutely. Yeah, so it was important that the lamb being offered be a male without defect, because the masculinity speaks to the strength, but also to remember that it was Adam that sinned in the garden. Also, this without defect thing. Animals, they don't sin, therefore they can't be sinful, but they can be imperfect in other ways. And so in order for this animal to be an actual proper sacrifice, it had to be as perfect as an animal could be. And so, if we could be perfect, then we could bear the brunt of our sin, but we can't. And so the animal, then, it has to be as perfect as possible so it can bear the brunt for us sacrificially. Anything else that stood out to you guys?
When it said all of it, the legs and the entrails, all of it, it just rang with me because I was reading about the Matthew's.
Andrew.
The communion.
Mm-hmm.
It said, drink the wine, drink all of it.
Yeah.
That just rang with me. I don't know if there's any parallels.
Yeah, so you're right that it is notable that all of it, the whole lamb or bull or whatever, was to be sacrificed on the altar. All of it. It was wholly sacrificed to God. There was no portion of it that was left over for the priests or for anything else. All of it went to God. And this speaks to Jesus, if you think about it, right? Because Jesus devoted his entire life to serving God. There was no part of his life that he kept back from God, just like there's no part of this sacrifice that was kept back from God. And even more than that, I mean, realistically, that's how we should be living our lives too, right? We should be giving all of our lives to God. We shouldn't be holding any part of it back. We shouldn't be people who say, well, you know, this is my God time and then this is my time, right? Because then we aren't offering ourselves up in the same way that Jesus did, which means then obviously we can't actually offer ourselves up the same way that Jesus did, but we can try. And I mean, even when we read in Romans, Paul in Romans 12:1, he writes, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship." And what he's referring to there is the same burnt offering, which means giving all of ourselves up to God in the same way that the burnt offering was to be entirely given up to God. Did you have something?
On the Old Testament, they burn the bones. The bones get eaten up in the fire.
All of it, yeah.
It has to be pretty hot.
Well, the fire was supposed to be burning continually day and night. We'll see.
Imagine it'd be a backlog of bones.
There could be, or they just kept the fire that hot. Remember, one thing to keep in mind is, but one thing to keep in mind also is that, you know, the most prevalent wood around there is acacia wood. Acacia wood is a very dense wood, and dense woods tend to burn very hot. So it's possible that they could have gotten it hot enough, especially if, again, the altar is burning all day and all night. You know, if they're supposed to keep it burning all night long, anything they put on during the day is just going to have that opportunity all night long to burn up as well.
An interesting point in the New Testament. There's questions about eating meat sacrificed to idols. Obviously, they weren't burning it all the way if they were sacrificing to the idols. So
They didn't burn the meat. They burned the entrails and the legs.
no, they were burning alcohol.
So it depends on the sacrifice. It depends on the type of sacrifice. There were different types of sacrifice. In this case, a burnt offering, they burned everything. The meat, the entrails, the bones, the entire animal was burned up and given to God. Now later we'll see things like a peace offering or a free will offering where parts of that are kept back by the priests who are then able to eat those things. But it's important when we're to realize that.
Well done, so it's not fair, not funny.
Well done is serve by good and faithful servant.
Well, but when we're talking about meat that's sacrificed to idols, we have to keep in mind that those things were not going to be done according to the rules that God laid out in Leviticus. So, okay.
I thought it was okay to eat the animal, eat the meat of it, but not in remembrance of the other.
Well, right. So it's okay for us too, because we know, one, that idols are just idols. They're worthless. They mean nothing. So anything that's sacrificed to idols doesn't mean anything.
Well, you just think that was halal.
But
What it says about that is don't eat it in front of somebody who might think.
Be offended by it.
Yeah, be offended by it or be confused by it. Don't, you know, if it's going to put somebody else's spirituality in jeopardy, just refrain.
Well, it's kind of like, you know, if I have a Jewish friend who wants to eat kosher and is deeply offended by, I can be respectful while I'm with them. Doesn't mean I have to abide by their religious beliefs and things like that with every meal I eat.
Right.
But I can show consideration.
right, and
Because, like,
But
I
the-
don't eat pig, but if it's offered to me when I eat with somebody, I don't make a big deal. I eat it.
yeah, and one thing to keep in mind, the reason that Paul says this is that Jews could not eat any meat that was sacrificed to a foreign idol regardless. It was very important that they keep to God's commandments. And so one thing that was happening in that time was Jews who had converted to Christianity but hadn't converted all the way were taking offense to Gentiles who were just eating what they would normally eat, right? So they would just They didn't have any problem with eating the pigs. They didn't have any problem with, whatever vendor in the market they purchased it from, no matter what. It didn't bother them at all. But the Jews, in many cases, it offended them because they didn't understand the freedom that came with Christ fulfilling the law.
Well, and I think it's interesting too, thinking about, Daniel when he was taken into captivity, when he said, I don't want to eat this because it's against my religious convictions. And they listened to him and let him feed his men, and then they did better and were stronger because they were following what God taught them to at the time, and obeying God, and God honored that by making them, healthier, stronger,
right?
All of that.
Yep.
And honored, in effect, the Babylon officials that allowed them to do what their God told them to do instead of saying, "No, you're our slaves. Do this."
Yeah. So a couple of other things that I want to point out is at the very beginning we see that this conversation from God begins, we see immediately after the tabernacle is finished, right? The end of Exodus, God came and he filled the tabernacle. And then at the beginning of Leviticus, we see God is speaking to Moses from the tabernacle to kind of lay all of this out. We also see in verse 2, if you notice, that God says, when any man brings an offering. And this is really interesting language because it speaks to the voluntary nature of the sacrifices. And we've talked about this a couple of times, where if we're not being voluntary with our sacrifices, then God doesn't want them. Well, the same thing's true here, right? Even though the Israelites are commanded to give these sacrifices, they still have to be voluntary in nature. The priests were not allowed to go around the camp, with a clipboard and saying, "Excuse me, Mr. Stein, you have not sacrificed this month. I'm going to need you to right now pick something and bring it to the tabernacle to sacrifice." That wasn't what God wanted at all.
Just thought of, I don't know if this has any parallel, but it's possible. Thinking even back to Cain and Abel. If Abel had the more, it wasn't so much about what the sacrifice was, the vegetables versus lamb, which it was to a degree, that Abel maybe had more the right spirit in the heart, and God saw that, versus Cain's like, why are we doing this? I'm going to give this. Because God looks at that too, obviously.
Oh, I think that that's a very large part of the story with Cain and Abel. I mean, part of it is potentially what they're sacrificing, but God makes it somewhat clear that it's about the heart of the matter that causes the issue between them. So
That's a good point, but
I don't
it did have to be blood.
They both were supposed to sacrifice. I believe it was Adam told them to, but not just what it was, but the heart behind it.
were you going to say something?
The priests were allowed to pick it for me.
No, that's right. So that's another thing. In fact, when you read through this, you notice that in a lot of places that we see, it's the person, the offerer, who has to do these things, right? Like if you look in verse 5, it's not the priest that kills the offering, it's the offerer. So you had to pick your bull or your lamb or your dove or whatever. You brought it to the temple, and then you had to kill the offering yourself. The priest would then take care of preparing it for the sacrifice and all of that. But it was important that you kill the offering. And we see right before that you were to lay your hand on the head of the offering, which is that symbolic transference of your sin onto the animal. Which is interesting when you then compare these things over to Jesus, right? Because we see in John 10 that Jesus says, "For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it again." So we see that Jesus was a willing sacrifice, right? He offered himself up willingly. And then, kind of as an interesting, maybe this doesn't mean a whole lot, but maybe it does, in Matthew 26, do you remember how Judas denoted Jesus, right? He came up and he gave him a kiss, but it's almost that transference, like for all of our sake, right? Because if you think about it, like our sin betrays Jesus in a sense. I know this is kind of like skating on thin ice here, but our sin betrays Jesus in a sense. So it's almost as if, as Judas has that contact with Jesus right before he goes to the cross, his sin is transferred, and then our sin is transferred in that same way, in a sense. Like I said, I know it's kind of thin, but I wouldn't say that it's not there. And then when you get then to the fact that the person who's doing the offering is the one who kills the sacrifice, well, you have to ask yourself the question, who killed Jesus? Like, even when you look in the New Testament, who killed Jesus? Was it the Jews? Was it the Romans? It was both. The Jews and the Romans, they both had a part in it, right? Because the Jews insisted that Jesus die, and the Romans were the vehicle by which he died. But when you look at it, if you've got the Jews and you've got the Romans, that's basically an analog for all of us. And so we all then killed Jesus. And so because of that, that makes him the acceptable sacrifice, in the same way that a Jew bringing their offering to the tabernacle, them doing the killing in part makes that the acceptable sacrifice.
Even without the biblical scriptural understanding of that, there is an understanding of that just in human nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I've even seen like videos of homesteaders and stuff talking about how there's a different level of respect that you have for your food when you've had to kill it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you understand that what your life consists of costs other lives.
Absolutely.
I think that's something that the vast majority of people, especially our country, don't have any clue whatsoever.
Oh, definitely. And it makes a difference.
It still reminds me of the ridiculousness of one of my friends saying the reason she tried, being a vegetarian, referring to her niece, to have to tell my actually that the cow had to die for her to have her hamburger. It's like,
That's the point.
roll my eyes. Like,
What they would do is they would bring that baby lamb into the house like a pet. Like kids.
love on it.
Yeah, during Passover.
And then the kids would be there when they so it was hard. And they would cry.
Yeah.
Break your heart.
Well, when you look back into, I think it's verse 1, I think. No, verse 2 then, where we say that the offering of animals is from the herd or the flock, which means that this is an animal that they have raised up. This is an animal that they've cared. It was a requirement. It had to be something that they had raised up, something that it couldn't just be some random wild animal. It couldn't, exactly. It had to be something that was a sacrifice. They couldn't go out hunting, find a lamb in the woods, just some random lamb in the woods, and say, okay, this is my sacrifice. That doesn't count.
Jesus started turning over tables because they started selling sacrifices in the temple. They were making merchandise of it.
That actually also makes me think of when Prophet Nathan came to David after, for the Bathsheba, telling the parable of, the man who's got
All the rubber duckies,
lamb,
right?
the one who has many, and how he steals his neighbor's lamb to feed his guest. That didn't cost him anything. He didn't take any of his multitude of what he had, which still would have made it a sacrifice. He stole from his neighbor, costing himself nothing.
That's right.
So,
yeah.
I've got a strange question. How long has the tabernacle been before Jesus was?
Yeah, it 2,000 years.
I would say.
Was it 2,000 years before?
I don't know the exact timeline. I'd have to look it up.
Temple there before Jesus.
Well, so if you think about it, Malachi is 400 years before Jesus, and Malachi is the very end of the Old Testament. So before Malachi, you've got all the other prophets, the time of the kings, the time of judges, and then all the way back up to the Exodus, right? And so I don't know the exact. I'd have to look it up to be certain, because I don't know it off the top of my head. But we're easily looking at over 1,000 years. Maybe not quite to 2,000, but over 1,000. I thought Phil might know it off the top of his head.
Like in 2000, but
Okay, so probably.
Some verses it was 2,000 years from here to here.
Oh, that might be.
I can't remember what it is.
Yeah. Oh, let me see. Hold on. Do I have in here? Okay, so let's see. So if this is correct, we have God gives the Ten Commandments in 1445 BC. So if that's 1445 BC, then that is then roughly a little more than 1400 years from there to the birth of Jesus. Now, I don't know how much I trust the timeline in this particular Bible. I don't know that I've compared it against other sources to be sure, but I'd say between 1,000 and 2,000 years is a very safe bet.
How long did they run the tabernacle for?
So the tabernacle was in place until Solomon built the first temple.
Moses in the Exodus was approximately 1491 BC.
Okay, so 1400-ish years.
Kings was like, wow, like 400 or 800 years of them.
Sorry, I didn't
Yeah.
mean to stir up that can of worms.
No. It's not a can of worms.
In Egypt, 400 years.
Right, but that's
Before the temple.
exactly. So if you think, yeah, so the time of the judges, I feel like that was 300 to 500 years of judges.
410 years from Moses to David.
Okay, there you go. So I wasn't too far off. I said 3 to 5. So yeah, so if it's 410 years from Moses to David, then you add another human lifespan on to that for David to Solomon, roughly, because Solomon built the first temple. And it wasn't until Solomon built the first temple that, right, well, but David wasn't allowed to build the temple because he was a man of war. So Solomon built the temple, and so when they built the temple, that's when they would have stopped the tabernacle. But they would have used the tabernacle all the way up until the first temple was built.
There's only like 90 years of the United Kingdom, the unified kingdoms.
Yeah.
Only 90 years, and then poof, you got two kingdoms.
Yeah, well, after Solomon died, because Solomon's children couldn't keep it together
Not to mention
in
Solomon
more than one
together.
sense. Yeah. All right. So I'm gonna let me go ahead and read the end of chapter 1 there, and then we'll kind of wrap on that. I said we try and get one chapter. We're gonna get one chapter. All right, verse 10. But if his offering is from the flock of the sheep or of the goats for a burnt offering, he shall offer it a male without defect. He shall slay it on the side of the altar northward before the Lord. And Aaron's sons the priests shall sprinkle its blood around on the altar. He shall then cut it into its pieces with its head and its suet, and the priest shall arrange them on the wood, which is on the fire that is on the altar. The entrails, however, and the legs he shall wash with water, and the priest shall offer all of it, and offer it up in smoke on the altar. It is a burnt offering, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. Verse 14. But if his offering to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, then he shall bring his offering from the turtle doves or from young pigeons. The priest shall bring it to the altar and wring off its head and offer it up in smoke on the altar, and its blood is to be drained out on the side of the altar. He shall also take away its crop with its feathers and cast it beside the altar eastward to the place of the ashes. Then he shall tear it by its wings, but he shall not sever it. And the priest shall offer it up in smoke on the altar on the wood which is on the fire. It is a burnt offering, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord.
Now, was it, I'm trying to remember, like, coming back to Luke chapter 2, when Joseph and Mary go to dedicate Jesus to the Lord, wasn't the pigeons or the doves for, like, the poorer families that might not have a lamb or something?
Yeah, so we see in Leviticus 12:8, it's written, but if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, the one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for her, and she will be clean. So that's specifically referring to when a baby is born. After a certain amount of time, the firstborn for sure has to be redeemed. But that's kind of a principle that we see throughout Leviticus is the ideal offering is a bull or a lamb or a goat. But if you can't afford a bull or a lamb or a goat, then you can bring birds instead, as long as they're turtle doves or pigeons.
Luke chapter 2 specifically read, I don't even think it mentioned a lamb or a goat. I think it specifically says a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons.
Right, so Luke 2:24, and to offer a sacrifice according to what was said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. So it does indicate that Joseph and Mary. What's that?
So the cities are just overrun. There's just not enough people sacrificing.
Well, it really just speaks to the fact that Joseph and Mary, they weren't rich. They were relatively poor people, which, I mean, makes sense if, when you look at the way God brought Jesus into the world, the people that he surrounded him with at the birth, like, it makes an awful lot of sense that Joseph and Mary themselves would not be especially rich people. I don't know that we can say that they were, totally impoverished, but they certainly were not especially rich.
It's funny because you read about, the first thing you read about Joseph is he's of the house and lineage of David.
Well, so is Mary.
He's descended from the king.
But what's also interesting, like can't remember if you had referenced it before or other pastors I've heard of, it's interesting saying that they were going to inns to find a place to stay, because back then you stayed with family. If you're going to the land of, your fathers, you'd probably have a ton of family there.
Were you going to say something, Phil?
True.
I was just gonna say, what I noticed about the first chapter is, the first verse is the only one that is not the Lord speaking. The rest of it, and that's what to me is unique about the book of Leviticus, because it's all direct quotes from the Lord. I guess Moses wrote this all down at the tent of meeting, but it's also directed to a people of a certain society. I mean, we don't have access to bulls. I guess we could go buy a bull, but we don't have a temple,
Right.
things like that. So I think it's more about the principle behind these things that we can apply to us. And since it's the Lord speaking, I think it's a very important chapter.
Absolutely.
But that's all. Those are my only.
No, I think that that's an excellent point. The book of Leviticus is, I think as we go through it, I think we'll see that it's probably more than 99% God speaking directly, just recording of his words.
I was reading Psalms 27 this morning. It seemed like I heard Psalms 27 from a couple of different points, but it said to bring your sacrifices as your praise to God, and sing songs to the Lord. So I think that's our spiritual sacrifices. They were coming fresh out of Egypt, and God, it seems like God had to lay down a bunch of rules within their society of how he wanted them to operate. But now we've got to the point, we've kind of got out of the era of the flesh, of having to rules for the flesh. Jesus is on the cross. It's more of a spiritual aspect now. So I think we can look at the flesh part of it and apply it spiritually.
Well, and it's important for us to understand that the rules that God gave to Israel served a couple of purposes, right? And on the one hand, they were to keep them out of trouble. On another hand, they were to keep them spiritually clean. And then on another hand, some of the rules were just to set them apart. It was because Israel was supposed to be set apart. They were supposed to stand out among the nations of the earth. And so there were some rules, I think, that were in there because God wanted them to stand out. Nowadays, I mean, realistically, just being a follower of Christ, a genuine follower of Christ, is enough to make us stick out like sore thumbs, right? I mean, because the law of God and the desires of God are just so different from the culture that we are currently living in. You really barely have to do anything, and you're gonna stand out. And it's just... it's interesting, for sure. Okay, well, I guess that makes it time to stop.